A viral video has once again placed El Salvador in the spotlight. This time, it's for the extreme measures taken in its crackdown on gang violence. President Nayib Bukele's government released footage showing detained gang leaders being subjected to what many are calling torture. Is this the price of peace, or has Bukele gone too far? Let's dive into this controversial campaign and the shocking viral footage that has everyone talking. The torture. El Salvador has been thrust into the international spotlight once again, and this time it's not because of its pristine beaches or vibrant culture. A jaw-dropping video released by President Nayib Bukele has taken the internet by storm, showcasing a dramatic scene where hundreds of gang members and prisoners are herded into a new mega-prison under harsh and arguably dehumanizing conditions. The footage shows that Bukele rules his country with an iron fist, a strategy he proudly promotes as the ultimate solution to the country's gang problem. But while many hail him as a savior, critics say this viral video shows a troubling slide into abuse of power and human rights violations. The now famous video shared on Bukele's Twitter is a clear example of propaganda. Close-ups of heavily tattooed gang members are interspersed with sweeping nighttime drone shots of the huge facility they're being transported to. With space for 40,000 inmates, this newly built prison is the largest in the Americas, symbolizing Bukele's fear campaign against gang violence. To his supporters, the video showcases his determination to bring peace to a country scarred by gang wars. Public figures like Harrison Smith of InfoWars and Michael Knowles of the Daily Why have praised Bukele's methods, hailing them as a global example for tackling crime. President Bukele has warned all inmates to behave and abstain from unleashing a crime wave or risk having their prison food taken away.
Desatan una ola de criminalidad y nosotros quitamos la comida en las cárceles.
The footage shows detainees herded into the prison like cattle, drawing comparisons to dystopian fiction. Men white boxers with shaved heads are made to march, crouch, and sit tightly packed as guards shout orders. While it boosts Bukele's political image, many are outraged, calling it a violation of basic human dignity. For Bukele's critics, the timing of the video's release is particularly suspicious. It came just 24 hours after the U.S. indictment detailing the alleged secret negotiations with MS-13 was unsealed. The video, they argue, was a calculated move to distract from the scandal and reaffirm Bukele's image as a no-nonsense crime fight. Yet, as the video continues to make waves, human rights activists and pro-democracy advocates sound the alarm. For them, this display isn't a triumph, it's a tragedy. The scenes of detainees being manhandled and marched into confinement is an erosion of constitutional rights in El Salvador. Under Bukele's indefinite state of emergency, the rights of Counter Salvadorans have been suspended, allowing law enforcement to imprison individuals based on suspicion alone. However, President Bukele's hardline stance on crime has gotten him unparalleled domestic approval. Polls suggest his popularity soars as high as 89%, a figure that most global leaders can only envy. But beneath the surface lies a far murkier narrative. According to a U.S. Department of Justice indictment, members of Bukele's government allegedly negotiated secret deals with the infamous MS-13 gang, granting favors such as reduced sentences and improved prison conditions. In exchange, the gang reportedly agreed to reduce the murder rate, creating the illusion of a safer El Salvador. This alleged backroom diplomacy contrasts with the image presented in Bukele's video. While rank-and-file gang members face harsh treatment of cramped cells, the gang leaders who struck these deals enjoy comparatively lenient conditions. It's a grim irony. The government's public war on gangs targets the foot soldiers, while their leaders benefit from clandestine agreements. For human rights groups, this double standard raises troubling questions about the rule of law in Bukele's El Salvador. El Salvador's state of emergency, declared in March of 2022, has led to the arrest of more than 60,000 people, an average of 150 arrests per day. Felix Ulloa, the nation's vice president, is one of the staunchest supporters of this crackdown. Ulloa, running for re-election, has made it clear that the majority of the people detained under Bukele's regime will remain in prison for the rest of their lives. For those accused of terrorism, the sentences are cumulative, Ulloa stated in a recent interview. You're seeing sentences of 200 years, 150 years. Most of them will be there for life. His remarks reflect the government's belief that gang members should face the full weight of the law for the decades of terror they inflicted on the people of El Salvador. El Salvador's defense minister, René Moreno, wasn't shy about singing praises for these measures. He said crimes like extortion had dropped significantly, which, let's face it, is huge for everyday folks just trying to lead their lives. He even claimed that the honest, law-abiding population was fully behind the government's efforts. Whether that's true or not, who knows? He didn't exactly come armed with polls to back it up. But while Salvadoran officials defend the president's methods, international observers survivors remain deeply concerned. Amnesty International estimates that by mid-2022, 2% of the country's adult population was behind bars. The rapid increase in incarceration has overwhelmed the justice system, and critics argue that many arrests lack sufficient evidence. Simply living in certain neighborhoods or having tattoos can be enough to land someone in prison. Human Rights Watch, HRW, has expressed grave concerns over the arbitrary nature of these arrests. Tamara Tarasiuk mentioned cases where individuals were detained for no other reason than their physical appearance. She warned that the mass detentions could exacerbate the gang problem by forcing nonviolent offenders into close quarters with hardened criminals, creating a breeding ground for further gang recruitment. Adding to these concerns are reports of inmate deaths under suspicious circumstances. Between March and October of 2022, at least 80 inmates died behind bars, according to the Salvadoran NGO Cristosal. For many activists, these figures paint a damning picture of a system where justice takes a back seat to brute force. Among the most alarming aspects of Bukele's policies is the detention of children. A law enacted under his administration lowers the age of criminal responsibility from 12 to 16 years old. As of September, more than 1,600 children have been detained, further blurring the line between justice and overreach. The impact on the justice system has been equally troubling. Under the state of emergency, pretrial detention can now be indefinite. This means that no of the tens of thousands detained, including those wrongly accused, have had their cases brought to trial after months of incarceration. Victims of gang violence are also left without closure, as both actual perpetrators and innocent bystanders are swept up in a system designed to prioritize mass detentions over targeted justice. Pro-democracy groups warn that the state of emergency has given Bukele unprecedented power to rule by decree, undermining democratic institutions in the process. Bukele himself has embraced the controversy, even describing himself on Twitter as the world's coolest dictator. For his fans, this label is a badge of honor, a sign that he's unafraid to break the rules to get results. For his detractors, it's a chilling admission of authoritarian ambitions. Bukele has maintained his stance that although his approach is not popular, it is reasonable. To him, everyone criticizing him does not have common sense.
Every country, I think, has their own problems. I would guess that probably our approach, that is very, very popular with the people, has a problem. And the problem is that it has common sense.
As the video continues to rack up views online, the world watches El Salvador with a mix of fascination and fear. Bukele's strategy may have reduced the country's murder rate, but at what cost? The harsh treatment of detainees, the erosion of constitutional rights, and the alleged deals with gang leaders paint a complex picture of a nation struggling to balance security with justice. For now, Bukele's popularity shows no signs of waning, but as the cracks in his administration's facade begin to show, the question remains, how long can this iron-fisted approach hold? And at what point does the fight against crime become a crime itself? The fight against gangs. El Salvador has long been in the spotlight for its crime issues, especially when it comes to gangs. You've probably heard of names like MS-13 and Barrio 18. These are the big players in what locals call maras. They're not just infamous locally. Their reputation spreads far beyond the borders of this tiny Central American country. As of 2011, there were an estimated 25,000 gang members roaming free and another 43,500 locked up, almost the population of a small town just in prison. These gangs didn't just pop up overnight. They have roots stretching back to the Salvadoran Civil War, a brutal conflict from 1979 to 1992 that left about 80,000 people dead, forced half the population to flee. Many sought refuge in the U.S., especially Los Angeles. That's where kids who had escaped a war-torn homeland ended up forming gangs to survive in rough neighborhoods. MS-13 and Barrio 18 were born there, out of necessity, frustration, a need to protect themselves, and a desperate sense of belonging. But here's where it gets messy. The U.S. cracked down on gangs in the 90s, which led to mass deportations. Thousands of Salvadorans, some who had spent most of their lives in the U.S., were sent back to a country they barely knew. They brought their gang affiliations and structure with them, planting seeds of organized crime in place already grappling with the aftermath of war. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire. El Salvador tried to deal with this in different ways. In 2012, there was a brief glimmer of hope when a government-brokered gang truce led to a 41% drop in crime. Killings fell from an average of 16 a day to fewer than 5. In fact, one extraordinary day, April 14, 2012. There were no murders at all, a first over 3 years. Unfortunately, the truce didn't last. By 2014, it collapsed and the murder rate shot back up. These gangs turned communities into their battlegrounds, where shootouts were commonplace, women lived in terror, and crossing into the wrong neighborhood could be a death sentence. For decades, these groups operated with near impunity. Extortion was a cornerstone of their power. Businesses, from the smallest street vendors to the larger fishing enterprises, were forced to pay renta, a protection fee that guaranteed nothing but their continued existence. Refusal often led to brutal consequences: arson, beatings, or even murder. Recruitment was relentless, targeting the youth. Boys as young as 12 were coerced into joining, often through intimidation or by being given no other choice. Once inside, escape was nearly impossible. Girls, on the other hand, were preyed upon for roles that ranged from couriers to unwilling partners for gang members. Families lived in constant dread, knowing any attempt to resist could make them the next targets. The rivalry between gangs turned neighborhoods into war zones. Streets were divided into invisible lines. Crossing these lines could mean death. The mangroves and rivers, once symbols of natural beauty, became hideouts for criminals and sites for dumping bodies. It wasn't uncommon to hear stories of fishermen discovering corpses tangled in their nets, grim reminders of the violence that gripped the town. Gang leaders, often operating from within prisons or distant strongholds, controlled operations with chilling efficiency. Orders for killings, extortion, and turf wars were handed due through encrypted messages or trusted messengers. The police, underfunded and outnumbered, struggled to make any meaningful dent in gang activities. In many cases, officers were either too afraid to intervene or were themselves compromised. For the residents, survival meant silence. Reporting crimes to the police was unthinkable, as informants were swiftly dealt with. People adapted to the rules imposed by the gangs, keeping their heads down and trying not to draw attention. Fear became a way of life, and hope for a peaceful future seemed like a distant dream. This was the reality of the people of El Salvador before the government's sweeping crackdown on gang activity. But even as the town began to change under the new policies, the scars left by years of gang dominance remained deeply embedded in its fabric. In 2022, a shocking surge in violence left 92 people dead in just a few days. It was one of the deadliest displays of gang power in recent history. In response, President Nayib Bukele declared a national state of emergency and launched an aggressive crackdown. His government detained over 65,000 alleged gang members, dismantling their operations with military precision. For the first time in years, residents reported walking the streets without fear and running businesses without the looming threat of extortion. Life inside El Salvador's infamous Center for the Confinement of Terrorism is nothing short of nightmarish. Built specifically to house the country's most dangerous gang members, primary from MS-13 and Barrio 18, this prison in Tecoluca is designed to hold an astonishing 40,000 inmates. Imagine cramming 2 Madison Square Gardens full of people and calling it a facility. Recently, more than 2,000 gang members were shipped off to this fortress, part of President Nayib Bukele's brutal crackdown on organized crime. Over the last years, the government has detained over 70,000 individuals in a relentless effort to clean up the streets. And when you see what goes on inside this place, you might understand why no one comes out alive. Not because they're executed, but because surviving there seems next to impossible. Cells are cramped, artificially lit, and frankly designed to break spirits. There's no natural light and barely any room to breathe. Inmates spend almost their entire day locked inside, except for a measly 30 minutes they're allowed out. And forget gym equipment. Exercise there is strictly body weight only because officials worry that anything Mo could turn into a weapon. Gangs were resourceful on the outside. You don't want to hand them free tools to be dangerous on the inside. Meals are as basic as it gets: rice, pasta, or maybe a hard-boiled egg. Utensils are completely off limits because guards worry they could be turned into weapons. Inmates eat everything with their hands. Security is airtight. Armed guards watch the prisoners like hawks, counting heads while they sit squatting on the floor, their hands clasped behind their back. Transport isn't much better. When these men are moved, they're packed into buses like sardines, heads bowed, hands tied, with no room to so much as shift in their seats. It's like the worst carpool ever, multiplied by 10. And the worst part? No one ever gets out. This is a one-way ticket to what feels like purgatory on Earth. It's all part of Bukele's message to the gangs. Once you're in, you're done, finished, forgotten. This isn't just a prison, it's a machine built to strip inmates of every ounce of humanity they have left. Whether you think that's justice or cruelty, one thing's for sure: nobody walks out of Tecoluca the same, or at all. The rapid decline of gang influence has been noticeable in communities where residents now feel safer to gather and speak freely, something that was once impossible due to fear of retaliation. With gang members imprisoned, isolated, and facing physical and psychological abuse, their ability to regroup seems diminished. Yet remnants of these groups still exist, and some members continue to commit petty crimes, hinting that the gangs gangs could adapt and revive through new structures or forms of crime like extortion. Ultimately, the future remains uncertain. While the gangs have been severely weakened, without a long-term strategy to address the social issues that led to their rise, El Salvador could face a precarious balance, with the potential for either gang resurgence or state-driven criminal monopolies. There is, however, an ongoing campaign against Bukele's anti-gang measures, mainly because of the way these suspected gang members are handled. The campaign against El Salvador. In El Salvador, a country once synonymous with gang violence and insecurity, President Nayib Bukele's bold anti-gang measures have sparked a global debate. Since starting a major gang crackdown in March 2022, Bukele has gained strong support at home, but has faced growing criticism from human rights groups. His tough approach, praised for improving the nation's safety, has also been criticized for alleged human rights abuses, especially against vulnerable groups like children. The sweeping anti-gang campaign, enacted under a state of emergency, has led to the arrest of over 80,000 alleged gang members. Interestingly, this isn't the first time El Salvador has seen a dip in violence under Bukele's leadership. When President Nayib Bukele came to power in 2019, the murder rate was already falling. Back in 2015, the country saw a staggering 6,656 murders. By 2021, that number was down to 1,140. Pretty impressive. But still, the beginning of 2022 was rough, with homicide numbers climbing again. March 26th was a particularly dark day, one of the deadliest in decades. It was therefore necessary for Bukele to implement strict measures. However, reports from Human Rights Watch, HRW, reveal that the indiscriminate nature of these arrests has ensnared thousands of minors, many of whom had no apparent ties to gang activities. A July 2024 Human Rights Watch report detailed how 3,319 children were apprehended during mass raids, often targeting low-income neighborhoods deemed crime hotspots. These arrests, carried out with little regard for due process, reveals a disturbing pattern of profiling based on physical appearance or socioeconomic background. The accounts of abuse within the prison system are harrowing. At least 60 children reportedly suffered physical beatings, torture, and other forms of mistreatment while in custody. Deprived of basic necessities such as adequate food, healthcare, and family contact, these minors endured unimaginable suffering. Some were coerced into making false confessions, while others became victims of violence and sexual assault at the hands of adult detainees. Authorities' failure to intervene in these cases has left lifelong scars on many of these young victims. One of the key concerns for the future of El Salvador's security is whether the gangs will resurge, either through internal prison networks or through the formation of new criminal groups. There are also questions regarding the sustainability of Bukele's aggressive tactics, particularly as the costs associated with maintaining mass incarceration and violating due process may become unsustainable in the long run. Without addressing the root causes of gang formation, poverty, unemployment, and broken social systems, the government risks setting the stage for future criminal growth. Additionally, there are fears that exiled gang members, particularly in neighboring countries like Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras, could create new cells or reintegrate into criminal networks. While the gang's physical decline is apparent, there is the possibility that the power vacuum left behind could either be filled by new criminal organizations or by state-embedded networks, further consolidating Bukele's authority. The involvement of state actors in corruption scandals and the lack of accountability in government actions present challenges for long-term stability. Juanita Gobertus, Human Rights Watch's America's director, voiced her concern over the government's approach, stating, "Many children have been doubly victimized, first by gang members who abused them, and then by security forces who detained and mistreated them with possible lifelong consequences." She urged El Salvador's government to adopt a rights-respecting and effective policy that not only dismantles gangs but also addresses the root causes of child recruitment. International condemnation of El Salvador's anti-gang measures has been swift and pointed. The United Nations Human Rights Office is deep concerned about reports of abuse, unfair arrests, and the weakening of legal rights under Bukele's administration. While the crackdown has greatly reduced the country's homicide rate, critics say it has severely harmed civil liberties. The state of emergency, which suspends key constitutional protections, has become a cornerstone of Bukele's strategy. It allows security forces to carry out mass arrests without warrants and detain suspects for extended periods without formal charges. While these measures have been effective in curbing gang violence, they have also created an environment ripe for abuse. Human rights organizations have documented numerous cases of individuals, including children being imprisoned based on flimsy or non-existent evidence. A particularly chilling aspect of this crackdown is the harsh prison sentences handed down to minors. According to HRW, individuals can face up to 12 years in prison for broadly defined crimes, often without adequate legal representation. These sentences not only punish individuals who may be innocent, but also perpetuate a cycle of trauma and marginalization. Despite these allegations, President Bukele remains immensely popular among Salvadorans. His tough-on-crime policies have transformed El Salvador into one of the safest countries in the Americas, a stark contrast to its previous reputation as a murder capital. Bukele's re-election in February 2024, with an overwhelming 85% of the vote, reflects the public's approval of his methods. The people are happy they can finally go to bed with both eyes closed. In a recent speech, Bukele doubled down on his approach, warning other potential offenders to reform or face similar consequences. For many Salvadorans, the dramatic drop in homicides and the newfound sense of safety outweigh concerns about human rights violations. Families in once gang-controlled neighborhoods now gather without fear, and businesses thrive in areas that were previously no-go zones. These tangible improvements have improved Bukele's image as a leader willing to take bold steps to secure his nation's future. However, human rights activists argue that security should not come at the expense of justice and dignity. They warn that the long-term consequences of Bukele's policies could be devastating, particularly for the children caught in the crossfire. The arbitrary arrests, lack of due process, and reports of abuse risk alienating a generation and fueling resentment against the state. El Salvador stands at a crossroads. The success of Bukele's anti-gang measures in reducing crime is undeniable, but the human cost cannot be ignored. As the nation moves forward, the challenge lies in finding a way to maintain public safety without sacrificing the rights and dignity of its citizens. For Bukele's administration, this means taking a hard look at the policies and practices that have drawn international condemnation. Addressing the abuses documented by HRW and other organizations is a critical step toward restoring trust in the justice system. It also requires a commitment to transparency, accountability, and the rule of law. Ultimately, the story of El Salvador's anti-gang campaign is one of triumph and tragedy. It is not a total triumph, and it is not a complete tragedy. It is just somewhere in between. It is a testament to the power of bold leadership, but also a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority. As the world watches, the decisions made today will shape the nation's future and determine whether El Salvador can truly achieve lasting peace. And with that, we've come to the end of today's video. If you enjoyed this video, just click on any of the cards showing on your screen to watch more content like this.